Hello, this is JFL, John Francis Leader, and welcome to the Body, Mind, Self podcast. So, my guest today is Dr. Brendan Rooney. Brendan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks a million. Delighted to be here.
So, I have wanted to have you on the podcast for a very long time.
I've wanted to be on the podcast for a very long time.
I've wanted you on the podcast even before I started the podcast. I knew I was going to start the podcast because we've kind of known each other on and off for actually quite a while. Because we've shared paths, I suppose, at the moment where we're both knocking around UCD doing our various things. Those various things that we do themselves have some interesting commonalities to each other too. We're also both in the Psychological Society of Ireland, which I think is where I first met you, probably at a conference, I think a number of years ago was the first time we chatted. And of course, one of the big things you do, which is highly aligned to my own interests, is your current chair, I think, at the moment, and you founded the Special Interest Group for Media, Art and Cyberpsychology, SIGMAC.
That's right.
PSI.
I'm past chair at the moment.
Past chair, okay,
ex-chair. I did set it up, so no one can take that away from me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that itself is fascinating. We'll get to that a bit more. But that's, I suppose, how our paths have crossed. For anybody who doesn't know you, how would you introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? What are your interests?
Yeah, good question. I think I would say I'm a psychologist who has broad interests. And then whenever I try and think, because, in academia, it's important to have this academic signature, and I try and describe my interests, I always come back to this idea of the interaction between cognition and emotion, which is quite broad. And then I always add on that it's in the context of media and entertainment and technology, because these are instruments and tools that for all sorts of reasons and for a long, long time, people have been using them to either regulate someone else's emotion or regulate their own emotion via attention. So I'm interested in that process.
Now, from the very start, you've brought up a very interesting point, which is, when you try to define yourself, there's a bit of a problem, isn't there? Because if you go too narrow, as sometimes seems to be the case with academia, and there's some weird, really obscure subset of some subject, it seems that you lose an awful lot of the context of that you might want to capture. But at the same time, when you go too broad and you say, well, I focus on experience or perception, and you leave it at that, it seems to lack some discipline.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing, isn't it?
I think that's exactly the issue. And then the thing that collects my work most of the time is my interest in the methods and tools we use. So I think as a psychologist in this kind of journey to try and explore the mind and tap into the immeasurable aspects, you start to focus on the tools we use, and my skills and expertise tend to be around research methods, research design, and then I see things like media and entertainment as part of that world, part of that tools that researchers can use that are rich and real life and at the same time highly controllable. That trade-off has existed before in a lot of research, this idea that a researcher can bring you into the lab and they can find out when they set the volume at this level, the brightness of the screen this level, they've this many people, you're in this chair, it doesn't move. How do you respond in this weird situation? And then it doesn't generalize beyond that. And then the flip side is that the researchers who go out into the real world, into the field, and then they've no control over these things, so they might find effects, but they're not sure if that will generalize either. So I guess it's trying to find the balance between those in my work.
And I don't think they need to be in conflict, but it does pose a bit of an existential problem when you try and write your name on a business card or sum it up very, very simply. It's like if people who know you, they get it, isn't it? But the elevator pitch becomes a little bit difficult.
You're right.
Somebody says, what do you do? You say, what do you need? Isn't it? It's a bit tricky. Why that? What got you on this path?
I've wondered about that. Someone asked me the other day what music I like, and I realized I'm using Spotify to figure that out. The way when these things. So I'm looking back at the things I do and the work I do to try and figure out why or where it came from. But what I can tell you is I've always loved TV and film, but bigger than that, I've loved stories, and I think I can get quite excited and I get lost in, the fantasy, in spirituality, in bigger ideas, and the same in science as well. There's this and it's an intersection between wanting to answer questions that are hard, tough, or quantitative, and then looking at what they mean in the bigger picture. And like I say, a really rich area for me to do my work found its place in this media entertainment stuff.
And that, what you just said there, I think sums up what I found interesting about your work is that mix of that rather rigorous science with that slightly more esoteric at times sense of how we feel and kind of the journey that we're on, the story or the narrative that's at play. And sometimes those things are, I don't even need to say attention. I think sometimes they're just different streams that aren't even attention. People go off in very different directions with them.
Yeah.
What's been your experience of that?
Yeah, so my as an undergraduate student, I was really taken by Professor Kieran Benson's work. He was my lecturer at the time, and he was originally a developmental psychologist looking at the way in which children grow and develop different capacities. And his work moved on into exploring philosophy and bigger ideas of how we generate an idea of self or this concept of self. And as an undergraduate student, I think I really liked his approach, his love of like culture and arts and film, but at the same time his interest in something big like what is self and the functional approach. What does it do for us? How do we use it? And that's another thing that I like to bring into my work is this functional approach. So he supervised my undergraduate project, my postgraduate work, and then he retired during my PhD. And I think that fostered those interests in me and allowed me to grow them a bit.
Yeah, led you to bridge those together.
Yeah,
because it's not even okay to bring them together. It strikes me as fundamentally necessary if we're to do good science or good art, for that matter.
Yeah,
they lend themselves to each other.
I think with my interest in research methods and statistics and research design and in teaching students, I would have to give them feedback, and I'd have to identify what it was that I felt was missing, or why was I not excited by this particular piece of work. And it was that bit that was missing. It was adherence to the rules, so much so that that something got lost in it. And like the discussions of APA style referencing or degrees of freedom in a statistical test, that it was very necessary for me to not just teach these skills, but make sure students adhere to them, because they're living in this world that needs them. And at the same time trying to communicate to them that that's a system and that there are bigger things in life. And it's a difficult job to do, I think.
I've always been kind of inspired by kind of play school type education, and like the work of Marie Montessori and that type of approach. And sometimes I think they get it right at such a young age. We don't teach mathematics and the abstract. We've got a bunch of stuff that we're adding and removing, and it's not that there isn't mathematical principle to that. There certainly is, very much so. I know my young son, he just loves numbers, and it's counting everything and that, but it's not in the abstract either. It is very applied and grounded in some way, and it is an emotional experience, the satisfaction of adding things up, of stacking things, of dividing them, of playing with them.
I went to a couple of years back now, I went to what was called the Seamus Heaney lecture series in St. Pat's, where they were talks about teaching education, and it was teaching creativity was the theme. And one of the speakers there, the name escapes me at the moment, but maybe I'll let you know later, is he drew that same observation that you made, but he drew connections with how the ancient Egyptians learned about physics by building a pyramid, and and the theory was added on later, so that he says in modern societies, we do it the other way around, where we teach them all the abstract stuff first, and then they have to go off into the world and apply it. And he felt that it was backwards.
Yeah, right. And so there is, we inherently are storytelling, and I know that's a theme that keeps coming up in your work, and certainly in mine. That's in my therapeutic focus particularly is something that comes up again and again. Obviously in entertainment we see it, but in education we really do too. We're always trying to tell ourselves stories to make sense of the world in some way so that we can navigate it. There's a danger in just focusing on the content but not looking at how the content comes together in some sort of a story arc for us. Yeah. How do you think about some of those topics in your work?
Yeah, that reminds me, recently I heard an interview with Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercer, I think, have a new book out called Enigma of Reason. And in it they're arguing that they set up this paradox that reason, if it's this human special trait that people say, something we developed that's so good for us and it's so great, it makes us special, that they argue, well then why hadn't it evolved in any other animals? And also, why are we so bad at it? Why are there so many mistakes? Why is there cognitive bias and all these sorts of things? And so they argue that it's not the case. Instead, reason is used as a function in a social world for us to align what we've already done with the goals of the group or the goals of others to bring them in line with us, and then perhaps more slowly to learn about what we did, but moving away from this idea that we rationally decide on how we're going to be and how and I just love this idea that the rational side of our mind, the conscious, the reason, is this like accidental add-on, and it's from that the story we tell comes. Sure. and that's links with the work by Professor Kieran Benson on how he says self is a story we tell that's works as like a cultural locative system, he calls it, for us to place ourselves in a social world. So I love those ideas that we're behaving, we're doing, we're responding, we're living in the world, and at the same time we're just constantly telling these stories about ourselves and about others.
And we need to, isn't it? Because while there's quite a bit given in the present moment around us, there's so much that isn't. And of course, when we talk about storytelling, it's tempting to think of it in a very conscious, cognitive sense of oh yes, I'm here, I need to go there, and I've come from that other place. But of course, just to look at any object and know what the hell we're looking at requires a huge amount of storytelling in a very implicit sense.
Yeah, exactly, it does. And we tell ourselves stories about ourselves at the same time. It's not always a message that's to the outside as well. I think that's important.
And it's complex, and for me it stands out as being very much the job of therapy. And I mean therapy in a very broad sense, not as we've discussed before, sitting in the room with one person for an hour, but just how we progress, how we develop, which is a therapeutic experience to the degree that we are progressing and going well. Because those stories can need updating like software does. It's interesting, sometimes they were wrong to begin with through no fault of our own. We were just trying to make sense of the world in some way, and we had a kind of provisional story that we kept telling ourselves. Sometimes they were actually right at the time, but not anymore.
It's true as well that when we all agree a story and we continue to tell it for a long time, that it's formative and it becomes right, and that I think
important point.
To dismiss it then. So I'll give you an example. I'm a big fan of the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett on emotion. So she's released a book recently that's called How Emotions Are Made in the Brain. I think I may have that title not quite right, but sure. And her work is really interesting because it's the idea that emotion is a kind of not a purely social construct, but it's a constructive experience, and that we have physiological responses to the world that are and that we're aware of these, and that we have this kind of interception going on, and at the same time our brain is filling in the gaps, and it's part of this story that we've learned as a social construct. And to take her extreme argument then is that there's no such thing as these kind of 6 fundamental emotions, that anger is something different to sad, but that that these are ways in which we construe. It's categorization. Like,
Right.
so you have your rainbow, your different electromagnetic energy, but we see 7 separate colors. And we all agree that these emotions are these different ways. And she's arguing that that's holding us back. It can be the source of emotional problems and so on. And the thing there is that this is a story the world is telling about what emotions are, and all the research holds on to that story. So there's this huge body of research that supports the idea that there are basic emotions with specific fingerprints in the brain. But when we look at the evidence, it appears as though all the methods they used were always set up to perpetuate this story, to call on the things that we all agree. Now, in her argument, you know, just knowing this is enough to break us free of these emotional problems. And sometimes I have reservations about that extreme version, because while I fully agree that that model of emotion makes sense, I don't know if it's as easy just to let it go, just to shake it off once we know about it. Because this is a story we've been telling for a long time, and so much of our culture is kind of built around it.
Yeah, and the model I use quite a bit is that of physiotherapy, really, for changing beliefs. In a sense, it is a kind of a bit, because if we use the physiotherapy model, there are some things that can be changed pretty quickly. You know, you will find out a bit of information, you go, okay, I'm going to act differently. And I think the physiotherapy equivalent of that is the therapist says to you, okay, I see how you're lifting there. Maybe you work in a warehouse. Why don't you try lifting with your legs instead of your back? You know, so that probably pretty quickly you would get, and you would start to practice. But the actual development of muscle tone, that may take weeks and months. And so on.
And so I agree. That's exactly right, I think. And at the same time, added on to that is this idea of like, how I'd love to be Buddhist, but you can't be Buddhist when you're supposed to work 9 to 5 and you have to take your lunch break at this time and you have to get the bus. How am I supposed to be in the moment when I have to think that I have to get off in 2 stops and I have to pick up the kids or whatever? So there's this short term and long term things I can do, and then there's the world, the fully socially constructed world that we're part of that also is slowly changing.
A complication that I see, and I see it a lot again therapeutically, because I just have a chance to meet a lot of different people and see their stories, but I see it in my own life and the lives of people I know otherwise too, is that the storytelling is complicated because there tend to be kind of intentions which are valid and universal, but implementations of them which are kind of local and maybe need to be subject to change. In a sense, at core, we seem to want the right things, but the problem is we believe that there's one way to get them. And if somebody says, don't do it that way, it sounds like they're saying, don't reach for the thing you feel you need.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I think using media entertainment, and many times like big mass media or like popular culture is really important to me, because there's the way you tell the story is really important. What you're getting at, and it's and for me that's about the storyteller's ability to draw your attention to one part of the story over another, the characters, the moral, the setting, whatever it is. And that if we look to expert storytellers in the world, they may not even realize the techniques they're using, or they may explicitly realize the techniques they're using, but either way they're using these tools to direct our attention to different parts of a story, and when it's popular, when the masses consume it and love it, I think it says something about us as a society and says something about their ability to tell a story. And then what I'm interested in is to start to pick apart those bits and see what was that connection between the storyteller and the person. Why is that film moving my emotions, and how come the moral of that story wasn't rejected by that culture, but it was by this culture.
It's such an important, and culture was the word that was coming up for me when you're speaking, it's such an important, significant part of culture shaping. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because it tends to be used in different ways, maybe formally and very thoughtfully by the likes of advertising agencies, which is interesting, maybe for entertainment purposes for artists who may serve a great, and definitely do serve a great therapeutic good, but again, as you know, we think about things in a kind of a Hollywood continuum and a commercialization point of view and what sells. There's a little bit of debate about what actually gets released and what's really good for us and so on. when we think of kind of learning, education, or therapeutic change through those kinds of media channels, we tend to, a lot of the time, I think of something rather tacky and preachy, or, badly produced and hopeless in that sense, which always deeply saddened me. And I hope doesn't need to stay the case. It's not always the case by any means, but I think there's a bit of a perception of that sometimes. But it is a group therapy. It's a cultural development through these media streams.
Yeah, big time. And I think that the choice people have around all their engagement with these different stories and worlds is one of the greatest powers it has. But at the same time, people can make choices that might not be in their best interest, and be exposed to the sorts of stories, or tell stories, or consume media and entertainment that may not be what's best to serve them. The really problematic thing there is that outside of a therapeutic setting, we have these like moral judgments of how much time someone should be spending on Facebook, or how much of those TV shows someone should be watching. And then it's a difficult one to navigate, because people may be choosing these things because it's serving a function for them at the time, or maybe the source of the problems that they feel they have. And I think this perhaps more safe thing about therapy is that it's about, well, there's different approaches, but the one that lets them just see those things that are going on, so that they can make a informed decision about the kind of ways in which they engage with those activities.
What was your kind of original engagement with storytelling? What type of media or what type of stories did kind of younger Brendan encounter, and what did it for you essentially in the beginning?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is I don't often distinguish between different types. So instantly what I want to answer here is that my mum said it was a large family, there's loads of kids, and we'd 5 sisters and a brother, my 2 parents, and the sitting room couldn't really house everyone in seats.
It was like a cinema.
Yeah, exactly. But I think when I'd get so close to the television and be on the floor, and I was really young, it would strain my neck to have to look up. So that she said that I would watch the TV lying down, but it would be upside down. So I'd be on the floor looking at the television upside down. And she recounts this as this like amazing thing, but it sounds like I don't know, some sort of addict or something who couldn't even make sense of this stuff.
Yeah.
But so that's kind of an idea that like television is one that would jump to mind. But I have to say that even today, I was always fascinated by stories that wouldn't be seen as entertainment, because people would see them as like true story, or like recounting facts rather than stories. So for example, a story of my grandfather who went off to fight in the war, or the story of an auntie who I didn't know when, because maybe she passed away, and that these are stories as well. But and that I was always fascinated by these. What's going on in someone else's life, or why are my 2 friends arguing with each other? That I think there's a drama about all that stuff that we never would think is a story. So I guess the short answer is TV, but story was always around my house.
So you were fairly multimedia from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing about storytelling, is that it does seem to be, to one degree or another, fairly media neutral or agnostic, in a sense that the same story can be delivered via one media, another media, or across media in many respects. Yeah. And a lot of those cultural shifts that we talk about are multimedia by definition. And kind of the point is they'll be reinforced by a newspaper and maybe a bus shelter and maybe somebody chatting about it in the pub, isn't it? There's this sort of a mix that takes place.
And there's the movie, the book, and the song to go with it, and then there's the video game, and then there's it's on your cereal, as you say. It's really the model I really liked. I engage with certain theoretical models around stories and what they do for us, and one that I really liked is this idea of a situation model, so that when we try and make sense of any situation that goes beyond a pure visual stimulus, when you put a character in there, or an actor, or an agent, and and there's a series of events that are connected. The way in which people understand that is they build these cognitive representations, these ideas or models in their mind where they will, it's like creating a little stage for yourself. And what you do is you very little information you can do this. I can say a man walked down a road, and all of a sudden you're also adding in what type of road, what type of sky, what type of man, why he's going, and even with just extra little bits of information, your model may get more and more rich, or may get more and more accurate, if that's even a thing. But we build these models, and they help us understand things about the world. But these are the same models that when you told me how I would find this place, I'm building a model. It's a spatial model of where I have to go and who I will meet there. And these expectations and predictions are all built into it.
Yeah.
My interest in stories is that books give us information from which we build a model. TV shows give us information from which we build a model, and that these are all just routes by which we get the information and we build a model. But the idea is that the model that we build or work with, this cognitive idea of what's going on in a situation, is identical in its nature, in its essence, in its representation in the brain, maybe not in its content. It's identical whether or not we got that information from a book or from a film or from a real life event. And so that's why I think that the world talks a lot about, like, did you prefer the book or the film?
Yes,
and I think there's something like tactile or something about the process of engaging with the story that people have preferences over. But it means psychologically, or serving a function, there may not be as much difference between these fabricated medias and how we use them.
There's a number of important points there. I think we can
talking,
unpack as we continue. That's wonderful. I'm trying to cue my questions here because they're all wonderful. Maybe just to ground it before we jump into some of those questions, because there's several there that I think are wonderful. What was the bridge then for you, lying at whatever position or angle on the couch watching TV, exactly, looking up at it at that age, and then to studying psychology and taking that path? What linked those two?
Yeah, actually, only now that you're asking me that, it's really clear. I always wanted to be an actor because I'd see these actors on TV and in film. I always wanted to be an actor and get involved in film. I did drama. I did. I remember like auditioning for plays and films and stuff when I was very young, and then I think I thought that psychology would offer me two things. It would offer me a way to continue to explore the human mind and story, but at the same time I felt like it was maybe a little bit more stable than acting, which I don't fully still believe.
No way. That's like a mirror of my story, because my background was in film. I studied filmmaking. I was involved with the Irish Film Institute, a good bit film based down there. Really great people doing some great things, and I was focused more on directing and editing. They were the two things I loved, and I did a fair bit of stuff on film sets, some stuff on RTE, work experience, just really getting the feel of it. And I kind of had two impressions. One is this is great, but very challenging. But the other one is, God, if I'm actually going to earn a living in this in any serious way, I still love it. I still enjoy doing it. But it seemed to be that the kind of the skill sets behind it, though, were more universal than just one particular implementation of it. Exactly. You standing in a film set that you get a job every 2 years or something like that on, unless you're doing very, very well. So equally, that's what led me to study psychology. That's interesting.
Exactly what I felt.
I wonder how many people are in psychology for that reason.
That's everybody's story, guys. Yeah, no, I remember saying to a friend of mine that I was pitching it to him like, no, this is a great choice. It leaves my options open. Kind of like, if I was interested in being a fisherman, I could do the psychology of fishing. If I wanted to do, act, whatever that is. It just felt like it was really broad.
But there is something to that, and it's true that it's certainly not going to hurt your acting to have a psychology background.
Yeah.
However, I think a lot of people, when they start psychology, they get a little bit disappointed sometimes. There's all these textbooks and talk about people from a distance, so you don't really interact with people that much. Some courses are better than others, but it's not quite. It's wonderful, but it's not necessarily quite what people expect it to be.
Yeah, and there are many of our students these days who are very determined from day one to be therapists or clinical psychologists. It's a really popular route to go down, and like you say, that they don't often get a lot of experience of what that might be like hands-on until maybe they're already on the road to that.
Yeah.
And it was never really a major goal of mine, so without that, it meant I felt like I could, play in the sandbox a little bit more. I could explore the classes in philosophy a little bit, and I think because I wasn't as focused, I left myself open to kind of finding this weird area that we're talking about right now.
Psychology can also be very interesting route to essentially do philosophy but undercover.
Yeah, exactly.
And still get employed.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. And I don't mean that to offend any philosophers listening. I'm encouraging you to just your label sometimes and get a few more jobs.
And at the same time, my interest in teaching and learning, I'm just seeing the students coming in, and these poor first year students who have me as a lecturer, and all they want is a yes or no answer. All they want is to know that, do you mean I should just do this? And I'm saying, well, it depends. And I'm trying to encourage them so much to just enjoy that, enjoy the uncertainty.
Right.
And I don't know if they see the value in it.
Because the philosophy, the epistemic approaches we take to it is so extremely important, precisely because of the narrative and storytelling points we're talking about before. And that seems to be the risk, although, reductive types of sciences offer great advantages in so many ways in trying to constrain things and trying to have a good solid ground to build on. There's a danger, I suppose, that, it's like having a mosaic, having lots of tiles, but not actually seeing how they go together in a sense. Somebody needs to step back and use the evidence by all means, not just make up something.
Yeah.
But they need to see where it all comes together at some point.
Exactly. And what are the bigger questions that connect these little bits of evidence?
So in your research then, as you progressed on and as you got into psychology, what have you been doing with yourself then in your research, or what have been some of the topics that you've been looking at or following?
Yeah, so I did a master's in looking at some behavioral neuroscience of face perception and how our brain might respond to our own face versus others. And then I started my PhD around how we engage with film at a broad level. I wanted to try and use different measures to explore emotional responses to film. And I wanted to manipulate the films. I wanted to use multiple measures, and I wanted to try and manipulate the people a little bit. So I would tell them to try and feel a strong emotion or not feel an emotion. I would use different size screens, turn on and off the lights.
Okay.
So it was really about trying to manipulate the situation and see how that affected the relationships between the measures of these experiences that they're having, their skin conductance, their heart rate, or what they say. And so I published some of that work, and then when I finished my PhD, I went to work in IADT down the road, and there they have a wonderful psychology program that's connected with kind of a technology training, and then it's housed in the same institute as these.
It's a wonderful blend.
Yeah. So within that area, within that institution, and then moving on to UCD, I was able to start to work with some experts in the area of filmmaking and that sort of thing. So I worked with David Quinn, who's an animator there, and we were able to manipulate a pre-existing animation to explore the role of close-ups in film and how that might shape our engagement with the characters, and how we think about their mind and what they're feeling. It's the idea of theory of mind that we use in psychology. And from that, then I started using virtual reality. So a research study we're doing at the moment is we'll sit people in a virtual reality cafe, and they're opposite another character, probably not too different to this distance. And then that character, we can manipulate whether or not they'll make eye contact. with the person. And so there are these moments of connection between the participant and this character, and very little else happens. And then in addition to that, we frame it as either a kind of a narrative experience. We say, welcome to the cafe, this is what happened, you know, you met this person, the bus broke down, they're sitting opposite you. Or in another condition, we'll kind of shape it as this, we've designed a program and we need to make sure it works. It's really making the artificial nature of the whole thing salient. And so, again, as is my style, we used a lot of different measures: time perception, measures of emotion, theory of mind, and we're trying to explore the relationship between those measures and those manipulations.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, so it's another example of working with people who have made and designed these experiences, and we want to see how people are responding to them and what that tells us about the kind of mind and emotion.
And it's a fascinating time in that space at the moment, and we'll get into virtual and augmented and mixed reality in a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a bit of a renaissance, I suppose, at the moment of people doing really interesting things in terms of creating exhibits and installations and experiences, or whatever kinds of words we want to use. It seems to be a really good time as a research scientist to be in there making sense of what's happening, and actually having an awful lot happening that we don't need to try and make it happen ourselves. We can tap into a lot of interesting things.
Yes, exactly. So at the time, I didn't always have a lot of resources in my lab, and so we need to take advantage of the stuff that was out there already.
Yeah.
Find that strange film that has two different types of shots, and then we can see how those different types of shots affect things. And as time went on, then and more industry experts and artistic experts were interested in the sciences and meeting me, then we get to collaborate a little bit, and then through their research we can align it with what we need as research.
Now, there are some people probably a little bit more like us who have this kind of blend of academic interest and applied interest in one shape or form or the other, or come from a film background or whatever it might be.
Right.
I'm glad those people exist,
Yeah.
because it's very important, even just from a language point of view, to try and find the way to discuss those topics.
Yeah.
But what is your sense of the relationship between people in practice and then people looking at the theory of it? Certainly there seems to be a sense in which those of us who are studying these things have respect and an interest in what, say, a filmmaker is doing, what a director is doing, what an editor is doing, etc. So that definitely exists. Is there a stream much the other way? Because you hear a lot of directors are the people who flunked film school or didn't really go down that road even of film theory. But what about kind of the academia or the research actually informing the practice in that sense?
Yeah, so I think in some ways there are many disciplines, and not just the creative ones, where they're coming from a history of being told that it wasn't academic, like the humanities aspect of film studies, where for a long time other academic disciplines were saying film isn't an art, and then we've moved beyond that, and now I'd say video games can't be something that's of interest or art. The same stories. And I think when people are working in those areas, they become they have to protect that discipline. They need to draw a line around it and preserve it and foster it. And then when it starts to blossom, I think it's difficult to then reach out and work in an interdisciplinary way.
Yeah.
And at the same time, others are finding that in order for them to grow beyond their discipline, they're reaching out. What's interesting to me is how technology is making everything easier. You can have a heart rate monitor on your phone, and therefore an artist can now measure someone's heart rate.
Right,
All they have to do is read up a little bit about what that means, and suddenly they can produce knowledge that was coming out of only the top labs, 40 years ago. And the flip side is, then when psychologists are using films for their research, so more and more neuroscientists are finding much more rich and ecological data from using films rather than these reduced stimuli. And so what happens is these people do find each other, and then they produce this really exciting and interesting work, and when it becomes when it becomes useful, like this theory of evolution, people who don't do it get left behind, and that might be a slow process, but I think it means there are rewards to the interdisciplinary approach.
There are, and I think technology is just facilitating that more, isn't it? Because certain technologies require the involvement of different people, and as anybody who knows anything about filmmaking knows, and that's one of the reasons it's hard. It is a massively collaborative process, so that's I think makes that happen.
Yeah, but at the same time, knowledge isn't just in the ivory towers anymore. So the same,
exactly.
So people can access people can access all that research that was before, maybe inaccessible.
Because there might have been 3 groups before when I'm thinking about it. One is maybe research scientists studying media kind of in a lab somewhere by themselves. The other group is maybe a more humanities approached film theory or criticism type approach, who maybe wouldn't interact much with the previous group at all. And then the other people would be people out there guerrilla filmmaking. Right. And they may not have talked to each other at all. But again, as you're saying, if somebody now is guerrilla filmmaking, they're going to say, how do I make sure I don't cross the line again with my camera? They Google it now, then they find it kind of a study on perception, and they go, that's a cool idea, bring it in. And then they maybe come across a bit of film criticism as well, or theory that's based on a film that they liked, and they incorporate that into how they frame a shot.
Exactly.
It seems like a closer feedback loop potentially now.
Definitely. But at the same time, when we look one step further, before that, like the very origins of film was very much a scientific exercise. It was about how when we move these frames quick enough, it appears as though they're moving, right? And so the study of visual perception and how the brain works was very integrated in this idea of the start of what film is, and that there was less distinction between the scientists and the engineers who are making this stuff and the marketing that can turn it into stories. And so I think the distinction wasn't always there. I think film came from our interest in science and people, and
that's a very good point. And it seems that we've kind of forgotten that to some degree, and those generations unfortunately aren't necessarily around anymore in those particularly early days. Cameras have become ubiquitous. There is this sense you grab something and you shoot it. The technical sense of what's really happening in that moment gets forgotten, and that's of course good in some ways because it removes constraints and it promotes creativity. But I kind of think that a lot of the newer manifestations of technology at the moment are making us go back to those roots again, aren't they? And rethink what these things are and how we use them. What are the rules or the language for them?
Yeah, I was in Amsterdam a couple of years ago with a group of academics that I would really look up to, these big deals in the area, and they're talking about this grant writing they're going to do, and an engineer came in to the group and said, we can do so much stuff, we just need you to tell us what to do with it. And it was that idea that like the technology was able to do all these things, and that it brought them to a point where it made them question the big questions. What does that mean for us as people? Where can we go with science? What are the sorts of things we can do? And in the past, where they looked was to science fiction. They looked to the films and stories of Star Trek and Star Wars to start shape what they wanted to do with that technology.
And it's amazing how much we're needing to do that, isn't it? Because speaking of the storytelling, when we try to think about the future, we have to bootstrap it a bit and use our references from the past to think about the future, which is interesting. Isn't it so funny how when you think about the future, your mind goes to the 80s. Isn't it? Whether it's Tomorrowland and Disney or whether it's, so many sci-fi films. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, exactly.
Some I don't know what that means for the future, but I suppose it's always been that way. We have to build on it in that way. So speaking of referencing sci-fi, realism is a big theme that comes up in your work, and as Morpheus might well ask you, what is real?
Yeah, exactly.
What is real? I
think I was really, really interested in visual illusions. I used to teach this class to art students in NCAD on visual illusions and what that said about the brain. And what struck me as great about them is they all work on tricking the brain, because the brain doesn't see things as they are. And that so for example, all all the wiring that goes from your retina to the rest of your brain comes out the front of the retina, right? So it'd be like having all the wires on the screen itself.
Like what we do here,
Yeah,
basically. Yeah,
exactly. And so the light coming in the eyes, it's like looking through a hedge, right? Because you've got all this stuff in the way.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel that way for all sorts of reasons, and our brain fills in the gaps. So I don't want to get too like kind of silly on it, but it seems like we never see what's out there, right? And there's all those big philosophical debates that have been going on for a long time about how our, perception is in our mind. And yet realism became this thing that people would describe as a feature of the medium, as the film or the book. And I've talked before, you've heard me talk about Jurassic Park and how it was this weird situation where I was blown away by how realistic it was at the time. These dinosaurs were in the bright light. And at the same time, people would say, realistic? Brendan, what are you talking about? It's dinosaurs. And so it struck me that there was this realistic for me, or different types of realistic, and I liked the idea of toying with that in my mind. And all of these kind of came to me just thinking that I think we constantly define this idea of realism. And for that I'd say the extent to which something feels non-mediated as a loose definition. Rather than reality or not reality, this realism, because of course there are things that are classified as reality that might feel mediated in some way. So put that aside, and we talk about this characteristic of realism that in everyday language it's seen as this this single dimensional thing that went from yes to no. It was on a scale of 1 to 10 and it could be up this way, and I thought, well, actually there are multiple dimensions to this, and if we had a better way to understand it, we could use the way in which the brain processes information. And one of the most kind of useful theories, and arguably the most empirically supported theories of neuroscience, is this idea of a dual process. And I found that a really useful model for this idea of realism. And
maybe say a bit about that dual process model, because I think that is helpful.
I think so. It was made very popular lately by Daniel Kahneman, who has a book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And then others have kind of criticized that it kind of simplifies things, and that makes sense. It's a popular idea of but I thought a very good article was one by Stanovich and Evans, who tried to, two researchers who were constantly talking about this, who came together to try and address this issue. And so the problem they found, that the two processes, in short, that we have a way of processing information that is effortful, that is controlled, and that it means it's like this rational, explicitly thinking about something.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we have our automatic, unconscious, immediate response to a situation. So if I threw a bottle at you, you don't have to know it's a bottle before you move out of the way. You have responded, and you may immediately feel all sorts of nondescript emotions. And that it's a little bit later, even just a moment, when you realize it was a bottle, where you can process my intentions, where you can think about what that meant. And that separation, I think, is it just comes up in so much of the work when I'm looking at these different measures and different ways in which we engage with entertainment.
It seems to be a huge recurring theme, not only specifically in our work, which is inevitably going to demand an understanding of something like that, but in so many philosophies, therapeutic methods, and just thinking about day-to-day life, this idea of conscious and automatic, and it's confusing, I think, because there's a sense in which we say, well, hold on a minute, am I in control or am I not? And we realize it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. We kind of have these various patterns at play, these habitual reflexes and responses that we can use. And we like you say in that example, when really we're in a moment of needing to act suddenly and immediately, there's really very little, certainly, conscious interpretation going on in that moment in terms of what happens. So that model, as you relate that then to what is real and thinking about realism and thinking particularly in the context of media.
Yeah.
How does that model play out then in that context?
I love the idea. I use this analogy quite a lot in my talks of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz gang are all going to see the wizard, and they're finally faced before him, and there's explosions, and he's saying, "What the hell are you doing here?" and shouting this stuff, and they're terrified, and their emotions are really high, and they're shivering and shaking, and Toto runs over to the side, and he pulls back this curtain, and we see that the whole thing is an illusion, and that the wizard is a small frail old man behind working these gadgets, and the wizard says, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain." And what I like about that example is how it's our attention that regulates our experience, that we can see this. At any time we engage with a fabricated or media experience, we know it's, for the most part, and know is a broad term, but we can process information, we can access information that says this is not real, or this is a mediated experience, or I am in control here.
Right.
And at the same time, we can also process or access the information that says the sensory information I'm receiving is meaningful, it's important, it's moving. When I see someone cry, I know how to respond to that case. And what regulates our experience is our attention to one of those spaces over the other.
Very good.
So this is a model by Ed Tan, who's currently in the University of Copenhagen, and he's drawn on the dual process theory to say that we have access to the emotional, meaningful, and the kind of, what does he call, the executive space, this like artifact version, and that what regulates is that our attention, and that we have this like limited capacity in what we can pay attention to. And so the more emotional, the more explosion, the more meaningful, the more harrowing it is, the less space there is, or less interesting it is to think of it as a fabricated experience.
Right.
But the truth is, at any moment we flip between one to the other, and we can use that paying attention to one over the other to regulate our experience, so that when the horror film gets too scary, we try and focus on the fact that it's just tomato ketchup, it's just a film, it's just fake.
It's interesting, how we can do that. It never really seems to go away.
Yeah.
It's there, but it's just temporarily suspended. It allows the space for that immersion. And it is a kind of a trance, a hypnotic state we go into when we watch a good film. It's a truly fascinating, meditative kind of a thing, isn't it? And what's so interesting, I think, particularly with, TVs have gotten bigger over the years, and cinemas still have big screens, but in the living room when you're watching the TV, particularly back when we were kids, the size of the TV in our field of vision relative to everything that's happening around it is such a very minor part of the scene. There can be background noise, people outside, so many things going on, but all of that gets excluded somehow. This gets amplified. We step into it as if it was a head-mounted display in some sense.
Yeah, and there's some nice neuro work by a colleague of mine, Matt Bezdek in Georgia Tech, and how he's looked at how using suspenseful scenes from films, famous suspense films, narrows our attention, but neurologically, so that the parts of our brain that respond to those visual areas on the outside are slowing down and shutting off, because we're paying more attention to this really dangerous or life-threatening situation the characters are in.
Yeah, and the horror film example is a very clear illustration of that. But it is true, isn't it? Because the idea is, in an evolutionary sense, if there's that lion or that tiger in front of one of our ancestors, we're not noticing the meadow. We're not noticing the birds. We're not noticing the stream. Immediately this fills our field of view. And the other thing is that extends to the storytelling point, because, we understand our adrenal system when it's active. Actually, one of its functions, adrenaline, is it sort of shuts down that intellectual type thinking. The frontal lobe is less to do in that moment. We don't want to be thinking too much about it. We want to be a bit more responsive and reactive. So that helps, I suppose, that presence in that moment with really being with something. But what's interesting about it is the teeth of the tiger, being sunk into your arm, are not the best point for that to happen. Seeing it would be a good point, but even seeing it may not necessarily attack you, but assuming it will is probably a good plan at that point. But even better again is if you can hear the rustle in the undergrowth, and then make that assumption. So we can kind of see why the storytelling can become a problem at times, isn't it? Because we're very good at preempting things,
Right.
which can be very good in some situations, but can lead to problems in others.
Yeah, so there's work by Mara Notley which says that that's exactly the function of storytelling. Is that so? Again, I was reading this book by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she's talking about how the brain's job is predicting. So that's what it's always doing, and most of the time we're even physiologically responding to a prediction, so that our body will flood our bloodstream with adrenaline or glucose based on a prediction that hasn't happened yet, and that we're good at it. And that Mara Notley are saying that by processing these stories, even these fabricated worlds, we're simulating the components of them, and then we're learning kind of by proxy that they would say maybe we'll be quicker to respond to the rustle in the grass if we've simulated that before, if we've seen how others have responded to that rustle in the grass. And you could argue that an Irishman, for the first time walking in some jungle, might not have any reason to think he should run from a rustle in the grass, but if he's seen the story or heard the stories, and that might be a story of an old wolf in Irish Tales, or it could be the TV show he saw on an Attenborough documentary.
And of course, he may, in some cases, run more because a local may know that, well, look, this season is okay for that reason, or it's just it could go either way.
And that it's that's a really good point, and that it shapes how
stupid tourists, you know.
I think it's a good point, and it goes back to what we had said earlier, how the problem with stories maybe is that it only presents you with at times they can present you with a situation without giving you all the tools to manage it.
The self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of them I find is very interesting, because if a person worries about something, as you were saying a moment ago, that doesn't, to the degree that they're really present in those worries and they take them to be real experiences, they're simulating in that moment. And it's easy, of course, to see why that would have been useful for our ancestors. Those of them who would think about the journey ahead and imagine the risks on that journey, would preempt them and prepare for them, would of course be they're the ancestors we have. The people who just said, we'll go out and see what happens, they're not our ancestors. So that kind of looks after itself from a developmental point of view. So it's easy to see, though, how when you get caught up in the thought or the worry, because the body, compared to the mind, is a little slow. It takes maybe milliseconds rather than, very, very nanoseconds to make these responses happen, to activate the adrenal system, to do whatever it needs to. And because it preempts, just to be prepared, the problem is previously we had that thought which concerned us. Now we're also having the physical feelings as well. And that seems to add weight to the thought in some sense, which can really create quite a self-fulfilling prophecy and a feedback loop. It's as if while you're watching the horror film, somebody then starts shaking the couch from behind as well. Exactly. And you go, this isn't just on the screen. I'm actually feeling it in a tactile sense too. It becomes more believable.
So a study that we conducted was to compare 2D and 3D film, and there were horror scenes. And what I was interested in is this idea of space and depth, where if you're watching a scene from a horror film, there's threat and there's knives and monsters, and that the idea of a physical space and depth where it may seem even more threatening. And that if the theory is right, then your physiology should respond more to this depth version. And at the time 3D movies were out, everyone was complaining that they didn't add anything extra, but I had to pay more for my ticket, and that they were, and I felt like the film companies were only using it as a gimmick, so they never used 3D for any of the good films. That's changed in time since then. So we did this study, and we found that the people in the 3D condition had a significantly higher heart rate than those in the 2D condition, in line with this theory, this idea that the physiology is responding to this space and depth automatically.
Right.
And then we asked people outside to just score on a Likert scale how much they enjoyed it or how scared they were, and there was no differences between 2D and 3D in terms of how much they reported. And it just shows that mismatch again, that I could say, had I just used the physiological measures, I'd be saying, oh yeah, the 3D is better. But from the filmmaker's point of view, better is you want someone to come out and say, I liked that more than the people in the other version.
Right.
And so there can be this mismatch and this interpretation of the physiological, and the people in that case didn't see that physiological response as more
Got you.
but they did rate it as more realistic.
Interesting.
Whatever that
Very interesting.
may mean.
It's a difficult thing, isn't it, to try and discuss and to try and control for when you're studying it, because clearly there's many different use cases when you're making a film, and it's easy to imagine circumstances where it would make one hell of a difference and others where it wouldn't. I mean, even something as simple as when colour film came on the scene, and obviously The Wizard of Oz is an interesting reference in that point, having both, but the use of colour, I mean, if you were to have done an experiment like that back then where you have colour and black and white and see what the difference is, I can imagine cases where it would have made a difference. I can imagine others where it wouldn't, really. You'd have to control for the novelty factors as well. But, there are some cases where that's going to really make a difference. If you just have a documentary with a couple of people chatting, if they're in a kind of a dark grey room and they're wearing black and white suits and they're talking, to hell with colour vision, it's really going to depend.
Right, and so I'm doing some research with a colleague of mine, Kathleen Ballant, who's in Tilburg University at the moment. And our work is to explore the way in which these formal features, the form that it comes in, can contribute to character engagement specifically, but other parts like enjoyment and that sort of stuff. And we've recently conducted some research just taking Quentin Tarantino scenes, and we're able to code them for the shot scale, the movement, the color and brightness, the volume, sound, and we're trying to model the ways in which these elements can predict how much you engage with the narrative or not. It's ongoing. We're still analyzing the results, but it looks like some of those features are related to the way in which we engage with the narrative.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I wonder what Tarantino would think of that. Any of that information. I'm sure we'd have to censor or whatever the opinion is in that sense. So this relates to that point of the amount of content that's manifest in front of us then. So as you were saying, that can be in a few different ways. It can be how big or how small the screen is. It can be whether it's wrapped around you or whether it's in front of you, who else is there, what's given in a given moment. Probably the simple ways of thinking about it is that book versus film distinction that you talked about before. Can you talk a bit about that, I suppose, the degree to which something is given to us in one shape or form and the degree to which we're bringing it to the table? The problem, obviously, and this relates, which we can talk about a little bit more as well in a moment, is learning as well, because there seems to be a sense in which sometimes you want the person to do the work. Even in a very visual film, it's a common technique to pan towards something but then stop and let the imagination continue, and what's just over there.
Right.
That's used as a technique. Yeah. Sometimes we want to take that to an extreme and say we're not even going to make a film, we're going to just write a book about this.
Right.
That's an extreme version of that. Other times we're going to blatantly show you every bit of it.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think the book film thing are ways in which people can categorize a range of different features of those media, and that they can have more diversity within those media than between them. So, for example, people sometimes think of watching film as a passive process compared to reading a book is a bit more active, right? But it depends. So, for example, when it comes to immediate emotion regulation of something that's scary, perhaps a film might be a little more triggering with the visual processing.
Yes.
Or social cognition of reading someone's face. In a book, it might be described. So that if we look at the differences between not necessarily the more obvious physical characteristics of these two media, but instead the things they typically do psychologically, right? So the presentation of scenarios, it's more difficult in a film to access someone's thoughts.
Yeah.
But in theory, a film that could successfully achieve that should be comparable to a book that was able to present the thoughts of the character. So it's important to mention, as you all too well know, John, that it's the way in which these experiences are presented and used that can bring about different sorts of skills.
Yeah.
And related to that, then we have this choice that people make. So that I've often, and you may have had the same experience, where I just want to watch a sitcom tonight because I'm exhausted. I don't want to watch a big thinking film. So that we do choose.
Yeah, I find myself on Netflix looking for bad things to watch because I don't want to have to commit.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid to watch the thing I really want to watch because I don't feel...
I'm exactly the same. I'm holding off on a series at the moment because I'm just not ready for it.
Yes, exactly.
I'm too busy in work and stuff. So that I think, and I don't know, I think maybe... presume it's universal that people unconsciously regulate their experience by choosing these different media, and that people who prefer to read over watching film are probably engaging in that sort of a task, that they prefer all the things that come with reading generically. But that's not to say that if they found the bad book or the one that doesn't suit them, they'd prefer to watch that film that they like.
What is happening as well as technology becomes more ubiquitous, because again, reading was sort of the only thing available at certain points. That was, the virtual reality of its time, and still is. It's a phenomenally rich experience. So one point is, as technology becomes more available and people are traveling and they're busy and they're maybe reading less in some ways, what happens with reading. But the other kind of related point to that is, I have an interesting experience that when I read, and I really enjoy reading, the problem is I enjoy reading to the point that I lose contact with the text, and it makes me free associate not irrelevant topics, but very relevant topics to what I'm reading. So I'll spend ages in a paragraph, which makes reading difficult for me. What's handy about film is it paces me, and it brings me along with it. So I have to kind of keep up in that sense.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting. But I guess that I think that's more about trying to find those ways in which you're engaging with that media yourself, and the function they're serving for you.
That's why I like listening, because somebody looks after the pacing for me, and disciplines me to stop my imagination.
Yeah, and then I think it's not to say that books don't. It'd probably be less common that would happen in a book, but there will be books that there's shorter chapters.
It's true.
There's
definitely
paragraph breaks. There's stream of consciousness writing. There's these different ways in which people can employ that same stuff.
And how do you see writing then developing? Because I know a lot of people, including podcasting, becoming popular for this reason, who are saying that the readership of their books is so minimal. The people who listen to their speeches is so much higher. It's a function, of course, just how we structure our lives to some degree.
Yeah.
What is the future of the written word in some sense versus other media, do you think?
It's hard to say, and it's probably, rightly or wrongly, perhaps wrongly, I'm less interested in. There's a lot of discourse around the ways in which different technologies are changing us and shaping us, and social media and video games and virtual reality, and that we're losing other aspects, maybe like reading.
Yeah.
And that it's true that is happening. I think I'm not sure. I can't say whether it's good or bad or neutral. I kind of feel like it's something that we just have to deal with, but I'm less worried about it, because when it comes to these sorts of things, I kind of trust humanity. I trust the masses a bit more than most people do, maybe. And maybe I shouldn't, and maybe, but I kind of think, this idea that we've been through it before with other things, like the calculator was going to destroy our ability to kind of perform maths. In the same way, I'm happy to largely let those things happen, but that's coming from a space where I'm trying to say that the function of stories has always been central, that here we are as humans doing our best to use technology to consume stories in a more efficient way, and that for me that's the important thing. I know that's controversial to say, but
it's interesting, and it just relates to technology generally. It's a huge question. I think I mentioned it before. David Krakauer of the Santa Fe Institute makes just an interesting distinction between complementary and competitive cognitive artifacts. The idea being that there are some things that do create a reliance on them, I suppose, like the example of the calculator. You don't have the calculator, you can't do it anymore. And then you contrast it to something like an abacus, which is complementary rather than competitive like the calculator, because apparently expert abacus users internalize the abacus. And so even without the abacus, they can still use the abacus.
Yes.
That's an interesting distinction, I think, to think about as we move into
that is interesting. And I think one of the reasons why I think psychologists need to be doing more research in the area of media and entertainment is because there are lay understandings of the functions these things are serving.
Yes.
People talk about distraction, or that I just don't want to think about it, I'll put on a show. So when we know the function of the calculator and the abacus, we can distinguish between what they're serving us, and that I'm not sure we properly understand the function or the ways in which people are using different types of media. So that if we're using them for this social simulation theory, or to learn emotion regulation skills, or to develop our ethical, social, or kind of political morals, these different functions that we could be using, it means that some may be more or less complementary, or what was the competitive, exactly.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that may have important implications in certain uses. How can we think about the degree to which we retain the effects of media experiences, how they shape us in one shape or form? Because, again, there seem to be a lot of potential use cases. I mean, you could say that, even from a therapeutic perspective, that it's enough to watch a film to have it make you feel happy or to cheer you up in some way, and that in turn will be a benefit that's retained and brought into the days, weeks ahead. There seems to be some other sense in which you'd say, well, we'd want more reinforcement than that. Any advertiser would tell you that, you'd look for emotional intensity of the experience, but also repetition, to really drive and reinforce the point home, maybe to try and integrate the behavior in some way. So there is that sense of retaining the effects of an experience in some shape or form. But that's an emotional effect. From a kind of a skill training point of view, then it would seem interactivity would seem to matter rather than just an emotional effect that's brought in. Retaining the effects of an experience.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it much. There is some research I'd love to do around. I've been thinking of it for a while, about the idea of what makes a favorite film when people can still feel these really strong emotions towards something that they've seen 1,000 times. And they know every line, and they're still, it's very much a part of their identity.
Yeah.
And I think there's also, towards an answer to your question, is the role of how we tell stories about the stories that we've watched. So that there's the fact that I have never seen The Wire, and no one can understand how I haven't seen The Wire. So there's this like social movement to make sure that I've seen this show, that I can, and I really want to, but that, they come up so much in conversation, these stories that we love, and that when I binge watch a show, and sometimes it's almost the only thing that's on my mind, I actually find myself like agitated looking for someone who has also seen this show.
Yes.
And then you find them and you think, great, I can talk about this. And what you talk about is kind of just reliving it with someone else. I think you're looking for ways in which to deconstruct the story. I've started to notice if I rewatch things that I loved, I'm calling it my second watch idea, that I love them just as much, and if not a little bit more, because it's almost like it's helpful to know the story arc to watch it play out again, and that if we are using media for these reasons, then deconstructing them together, watching them again, talking about them are ways to retain the effects. But like with any learning, it's probably doing that and then revisiting. And it should be the ones that have moved you, or the ones who have made a difference, or the ones that have challenged you as well.
The likes of the work of Kolb and experiential learning, and a lot of those processes tend to have after it a kind of a debrief of some sort of integration, and then follow through and layering it in some sort of way. So there does seem to be something to that.
I guess we're looking for that.
Yeah, but there also seems to be a point to also be said that I think it was it Zig Ziglar, the motivational speaker, who said people sometimes complain that motivation wears off after seminars, and he says it's like bathing. You need to do it every day.
Yes.
So, sometimes that's fair enough. Or they have the poker in the fire example too, that you take it out, it's as hot as the fire, but the longer you keep it out, it goes cold.
Yeah.
So there kind of is a sense that some things in our life, I like this concept or construct of an emotional diet.
Right.
That just as we have a nutritional one, and we take it for granted that we're going to spend a good bit of money and time in our life on food.
Yeah.
And we don't fight that too much.
Yeah.
We plan around it, we work around it. It actually becomes a cultural thing. We meet over food. We do a number of things like that. That emotionally speaking, that we can kind of consciously choose the media we consume, I suppose, as we would a diet. And it's not that it needs to last forever. The effect of one good film, if it does, albeit, but probably no food is good enough to last forever in its nutritional effect. But we can have these experiences.
Yeah. So I agree. I think when it was interesting when you described the emotional diet, because I think that phrase sounds a little bit like the rational construal of emotion. So it sounds, and it's my own thing, that like it's the meaning diet, but that's not what you mean. I think there's a physiological response that these things in the now regulate our emotional experiences. And that's a really important thing. I guess everything that I had been saying before that was this, I talked about due process, it was this rational conscious, but you're right that there's a physiological or automatic immediate way in which they're kind of like the equivalent of turning it off and turning it back on again with the system. Stop the ruminating thoughts, like focus on something that's not yourself, completely different experience. And I think that some of the argument behind how mindfulness can be such a powerful technique as well, but just like a diet or like a salad, you're not going to be healthy after eating a salad once. It's got to be like the bath, you got to keep doing it.
It can be, obviously you're calling it an emotional diet, so that might emphasize the word emotion, but it's probably as an emotional as a nutritional diet is, which is to say that sure, there's a feeling of satisfaction that comes, but it doesn't resist logic in any sense. A nutritional diet is inherently logical too. There's a complementarity there.
I should say I fully agree it's an emotional diet. My observation was that I did the thing that I mentioned. Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about how we think about emotions isn't necessarily the way her model presents them as, and the idea of the emotional diet brought me to this different place. But it is an emotional
that's
diet.
Part of the problem, isn't it? I think we do tend to split these things, and they're very useful to split, to discuss from certain angles. But really, I like to use this example of, if you think of a jam jar as being the logic and the jam as being the feeling, you want both. If you just have the jar and it's empty, what's the point in that? If you have the jam but no jar, it's all over your arm and it's a sticky mess. It's just emotion but nothing to constrain it. But they don't need to be enemies of each other. They can certainly support and assist each other.
And in some ways, in ways of more social or cultural practice, they're not different things at all.
That's right. We just get on with it.
They're the thing you buy in the shop. And separating them isn't always as useful as you're saying.
So we've talked a bit about media. Maybe let's talk about some of the different types of media that are out there. We have an interest, I think, and a background in film that we each have. But of course, computer games are just this huge aspect of this.
Big thing,
and then extending, well, not extending beyond that. They've been around for quite a while, but now related to that, virtual reality and then mixed reality and augmented reality. So maybe just go to the computer games first, because again, that'll be something that I think most people will be familiar with in some shape or form. How can we think about those? I remember, I remember somebody who didn't really play gaming back when I was a kid saying to me, it was like black and white games, there's a bit of ping pong on screen, saying, what's the appeal of that? That doesn't make any sense. But of course can be a huge appeal to that. Now graphics have come along. Now the budgets for so many video games, exceed motion pictures from a production point of view. It's not as obvious that they're necessarily different or separate art forms. There's voice actors. There's what's going on with computer games?
So it's a huge industry and there's a lot of money in it. And I think the development of computer games may partly be about trying to be as broadly interesting to as many different functions, right? We talked about the function of media, and that perhaps the black and white square moving across the screen, it's just like the fidget spinner, which took out that it's this simple, very straightforward way to capture your attention and shift it away from whatever else you're not paying attention to. But by taking that same feature and then adding in all these characters, all this narrative, all the kind of ways in which people can build an identity around it, more explicitly allowing people to link what they're doing on the screen with their real life or with their identity or with the groups that they're around. It gives more choice, more options, and then, of course, there's more value in it.
It strikes me, though, that even some of those earlier simple games, and there's a real retro movement in computer games at the moment, too, that likes the pixely kind of stripped-down approach, that there was a way, though, that we'd kind of reify upon those things. The alien on the screen would only be a few pixels, but it would be a symbol. And then everything we know about aliens and feel about aliens, we'd layer on top of that algebraically. That'd be the X.
Exactly.
It would represent everything we feel about aliens.
Yeah.
And it can be a surprisingly deep experience, which somebody else mightn't get, understandably, if they don't have that.
Yeah, and that's that idea I was saying about this situation model. We build these stories, we build events, we build a model of what's going on, and we can do it based on so little information. Because imagine if your brain is a system that works on looking through a hedge, where it has to predict, right? It's mostly predicting what's going on. It's trying to figure out what that movement was. It's default position. I probably shouldn't use default given that there's a mode network, but what it does, the brain's main goal is just to predict based on little information. More information is helpful. It can make more elaborate and rich predictions, so that these and sometimes there's that idea that not showing the villain in the film is scarier than showing them, because you're putting in all the worst traits. So that your creation of what's scary and worse is worse than what they could show. It can be
deeply personalized experience then, because 10 people in the room may layer 10 different things on the same symbol.
Right, exactly. And then there's, at the flip side of that, there's all this fear around presentation in video games of really highly realistic, disgusting wounds and injuries and violence, where it's highly descriptive and visual and realistic, and people are rejecting it and disgusted by it. And I'm not trying to make a point that one is better than the other, but I'm only thinking out loud here that it's interesting that the flip side can be so much scarier, can be so much worse.
It can do.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of an uncanny valley effect of types, isn't it? Because when computer games are using really well-designed assets and beautiful graphics, they take a risk because they need to really get it right. Now, on the uncanny valley, typically when people talk about it, they think about it visually, whereby it has to look very real or has to look not real, and in the middle is weird and eerie. But, as I think many theorists say, it's not just about the visual. In so many respects, you've got to get it right or else not really try. And we're happy either way. Actually, playing it safe sometimes can be, to be simple in some ways and let people layer onto it in some way.
And part of my master's research I spoke about earlier was using a technique of visual adaptation, where if I show you a whole load of faces for a long time where the eyes have been slowly moved apart, they start to look normal. So we update our thresholds of what's acceptable. And then you see a face where the eyes haven't been adjusted, and to you, they look really close together. So the idea of the uncanny valley may start to wash away a little bit if you've been playing the games for a long time, or you get to know these people, because now they do look realistic for a long enough experience. And and so it can kind of fill in the gaps.
And realism and narrative based too. Realism is so interesting in terms of the context that it's set up in. Another example I think I've used before is if you're watching a vampire film and the vampire is able to fly, no problem. That's okay. That's part of the story. The moment the werewolf starts flying, you get very upset. It's interesting.
And that this is this idea of the dimensions of realism that I think are interesting. I think at times they can challenge us and challenge simple things, very simple things that we want to take for granted, or that the rules of the game are X, and if you change that rule, then that means anything is possible now. I need to know what those rules are if I'm going to engage with this experience.
Because a critic from the outside would say, that the fantasy is just, it's just imagination, anything goes. But I don't think there's any more stringent bunch of people than fantasy. Devotees, isn't it, of breaking rules and consistency.
That's not canon.
It may be that, I suppose, because they're stepping outside of the norms, they have to hold on even more tightly to the norms they have, isn't it, to constrain the story. Because an unconstrained story is no narrative at all.
Yeah, I had this idea though that around the time of the popularity of Game of Thrones was also Downton Abbey and The Wire and and it felt like what they all had in common was that those three in particular, that it was a world we weren't as used to. It had its own language, it had its own rules, it had its own cultural hierarchies and ways of being, and that we had to learn it, so that it's so difficult to remember all the characters' names or know what's going on, but we do it, and by the time we do, now we're in agreement that you've presented a world with rules that we can... And the rules are important because I said how important it is for us to make predictions.
Exactly.
We're always trying to predict, so that rules are necessary for that.
I know Alfred Hitchcock has that quote, "Don't confuse the audience. A confused audience is not emoting." I'm not 100% sure, because I know confusion can play an emotional role too.
That's right.
But you can get where he's going with that, though.
That seems to tap into that idea, that difference between two ways in which we can engage with entertainment. There's that like emotional, engaged, completely,
you draw people out.
And that the confused viewer is looking to the man behind the curtain, so he's paying attention to it as an artifact. Why do they do this? But that's not necessarily the case, like you say, with some that a colleague of mine, Miklos Kiss in Groningen, is doing work around puzzle films, and this idea that like things like Memento and Looper and these sorts of films that are set to challenge you so that you'll realize a kind of an interesting quirk in the story.
It may be that word confusion has to be unpacked a bit, because there seem to be different types of confusion, isn't it? There seems to be a confusion which is still very much consistent with the story. I believe I'm there, I get the narrative, but I'm confused within the context of that, about what's happening within it, as opposed to, I just don't know what the film's trying to do. There's a difference.
Some people might link that with the idea of flow, where you've got the right amount of challenge. Right, that makes it engaging.
So can you weigh in, relating to our points about realism and then ongoing, enduring effects of things? We're talking about video games, and of course one of the almost boring at the stage debates that's been going on endlessly and perpetually, that seems to come up again and again and again, and there seem to be two different opinions on it, which constantly have been at war without any perfect resolution, is usually simplified along the lines of, do video games cause violence? Something simple like that. That strikes me in this particular time to be a very, very simplified question, particularly because what video games are, of course, is just anything but simple. It's like saying films. I mean, it's that broad. How could we, for the listener who's interested in the answer to that question, what could we say about that?
So I think there's some good research being done, but the problem that's holding it back, as you say, are that it's created these two camps, and actually the biggest people who are publishing in this area, there's a controversial statement, but the research has come more about themselves, that they're more locked into their ideas now, where I'm not sure that they can ever meet halfway in their debate. And as you say, this idea that violent video games, do they cause aggression, yes or no? Instantly I'm saying, well, I think the better question is, when might they cause aggression? And the boring answer to that would be the fact that if the masses are playing these games and they're not going out killing everybody, then the exceptional circumstances it may be difficult to say it was the video game that caused that, when we talk about these simple ideas of cause and effect. So let's appreciate that then, that that there's, at the very least, there's an interaction effect, or that something where a game might be a catalyst to a vulnerability someone has already, perhaps, or a way in which they've engaged with stuff. And I think, like, the boring answer is, I think we need more research that recognizes that more complex research, more research with game designers and therapists and from the human sciences and behavioral sciences. We need theoretical models of video game play that are more complex.
Right.
And I think until we have those, we're left with these research studies that have operationalized aggression as how much spicy sauce you'll put into someone's drink, and then they'll extrapolate that you're more aggressive as a result. The other area of research in this that seems kind of promising is not about whether video games cause aggressive behaviors, but the lasting effects of media games on thoughts. And so the extent to which violent video games produce these, what was the term, like automatic aggressive cognitions.
Right.
And that, I think, in those cases, we may or may not have a situation where someone can regulate those experiences.
And it's so complex, isn't it? And I think I agree fully that the problem is in a massive oversimplification of an incredibly sophisticated area, because as we really look at the topic, it's as complex as life itself, the media that we're using. If in fact, even if there was a very simple apparent cause-effect relationship between playing a violent video game and then violence, that could have evoked something that was very much already there, that was going to come out anyway in some shape or form. A book could have done it, conversation could have added. Anything can be a trigger. Somebody's saying, it's nice to see you today. What do you mean by that? Maybe you're feeling bad. Anything can be a trigger in that sense. Very, very complex.
Yeah, and in a lot of psychological problems, the extreme forms of maybe delusional thoughts, anxiety, emotional problems, and clinicians will often think about the fact that someone might have a genetic vulnerability or disposition, and some other situation. But then there's this maybe a stressor or something, and that in that situation, I don't think it makes sense to try and protect the world from stressors, right?
Sure.
But we don't want to minimize the role they play in that particular person's kind of state of illness. And so I'm not sure the best way is to regulate highly or harshly these video games, but we can encourage best practice around the way in which we engage with them in the same way we might with stressors. You would you'd never tell someone, we tell each other to take breaks, to eat well, sleep well, make sure you have a social support. These sorts of everyday things should be protective around the negative effects that any video game could ever bring about in someone. And that perhaps video games are of the nature that they're more likely to make someone disconnect from social support or spend a longer time without taking breaks, and might increase vulnerability in a little way, but that's not necessarily just the violent ones.
Something that I think frustrates me a lot sometimes in research is the kind of the operational description of what is a violent video game to begin with, because it seems to leave out, as we've been discussing, the kind of constructive role of approaching these things. I know games like Fallout or Skyrim or these types of games are probably the best example of it, where there's a very particular narrative and you really are taking a good or a bad role, and it get ambiguous at times. But it's interesting how, if out of character they force you to do something you really don't want to do, what I found myself doing is actually just creating a story to supplement what they're forcing me to do, to justify the action, not to justify the bad action, but to say, okay, now let me just modify the script of the game a little bit. I have to save another person in order to do this, because I don't want to do this. Otherwise, that's against my character.
And it's such
is that violent? Because of course, it may be protective behavior in some cases. So complex.
That approach that you're describing seems like such a powerful tool, is to shape the mode in which we engage with these things, the way, the depth at which we see them as meaningful or not meaningful, or how much they to us represent something that could happen in real life. And that your approach to regulating that seems like such a simple tool that could be fully built into any video game automatically. You could press a button on a game and all they have to do is replace the soldiers hair with big curly clown wigs as a visual reminder that this is just a game. Now, just off the top of my head, I mean, but there's also more narrative ways in which you can do this, and all of a sudden it's almost like an ironic way to engage with this this violent and the regulation of those modes. If they're a source for a particular player to be aggressive, then that might be a potentially problematic way to engage with the games.
Absolutely.
But there's no guarantee that the game itself defines that.
Yeah, exactly. We bring so much to the table.
Yeah.
A potentially peaceful game or experience. We could be imagining just a road with cars passing by, that those people are on their way to commit violence and we're just not reporting it.
Yeah.
Isn't it? We can make anything
Exactly.
any way through the way we approach it.
Having said that, though, we have talked about earlier the skill of these storytellers in their ability using things like formal features of film to have a greater control over the way in which an audience can engage. You, as a director, your goal is to make sure they know the story you're telling when you're really just showing, and they're really good at that. So if we have these game designers who have the same abilities, the same power, we need them to be ethical in the ways.
So this brings in the role of interactivity in computer games. I think are a good bridge from roughly film to virtual reality and various other variations of it.
Yeah.
How do you think, and how have you thought, because I think it's been very interesting for you, I'm sure, as it has for me, to have come from that film background, to have the interests you have, and then to have this new kind of renaissance in virtual mixed augmented realities at the moment. What's that been like for you, meeting what's going on at the moment, and how have you kind of bridged your interests into that? How has it changed things or kept them the same?
Yeah, no, I feel a little challenged by it because my students are really interested in it. They're far more interested in gaming than movies. And more and more, maybe the Netflix idea and TV is interesting them. But and I remember only really playing 2 games when I was younger, and it was like Mario Brothers on the Super Nintendo, and I remember playing the first Tomb Raider game. And in both cases I played them like extremely. I played them a lot, so I can access that idea of being like fully consumed by the interactivity in a game. And they're quite narrative games, the 2 I mentioned anyway, which meant I had the characters and the story and all that stuff. But as they change, as they develop, I have to make more efforts to know that world and to engage with it a little bit more. And I'm working with
that's a daily practice at the moment.
Yeah, I know. I haven't been as much, but I have a PhD student who's working in this area and keeping me on my toes. But the other thing to say though is I still maintain that my contribution to the work, if I'm right, means that it's the psychological function that these things are serving that is common around the media, and that there's definitely a different emphasis from games versus books, or people who listen to classical music as their form of entertainment. Sure. These are serving different functions, but I think the approach to it I can contribute to.
Absolutely, and it does seem like it. I'll put some links in anyway for any listeners who aren't particularly familiar with the kinds of technology that we're talking about. Yeah. But it seems that if we talk about virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, at least there's kind of 2 levels to talk about this. One is in a more general perceptual sense, in which case, virtual reality really has always been the case to one degree or another. I mean, on a very deep level, it's just part of being human to virtualize in some shape or form, to simulate, to think ahead to things. But even more locally, things like books and things we've talked about before are a kind of a virtual experience. So we can think about it that way, or we can think about it more in terms of its current manifestation, the likes of head-mounted displays, different types of augmentation where we layer things onto the world in some shape or form. As you take the world, I suppose, of the screen, or the kind of the rectangles that we've come accustomed to, where typically our games or our films were on, and then as you move into these immersive wraparound experiences that have more degrees of interactivity, what is the effect of that? We used to have this thing, we're sitting in a seat looking at this thing if we're in the cinema. Now all of a sudden we're wandering around worlds, we're interacting. I know this is all happening. This is an ongoing conversation at the moment, but what are your initial observations?
So, my initial observation is it's been easier for me to engage with this world given how recent and quickly it's boomed, and how user-friendly and accessible the whole world is, and how it's much part of all our discourse. So I found myself to be a lot more involved in this. And on a very basic level, one of the things I can clearly say, which is that more than any other media, it is obviously immersive, but physiological. It is tapping directly into our automatic responses. And we talked about, those two different ways in which we engage with entertainment experiences. And this one, imagine I described how Dorothy sees the wizard, and because he's exciting, she might not notice the man behind the curtain. This is like hiding that guy behind the curtain. He's not behind the curtain. He's off somewhere else. And this is a completely engaging, attention-grabbing experience. So that really, if it wasn't for the weight of the headset on your head, there's you could quickly feel like you're in there. The technology is still a little bit behind from this idea of a complete holodeck immersive room, but it's not far behind it, and that's happening soon. And so I think they're powerful, and I think it's important to quickly identify as best we can the appropriate ways to maximize the positive gains from the power of those.
So, while we could easily play the card of saying, let's see where this goes, and to a very real extent, we are going to have to wait and see where this goes, because there's a lot happening. As you say, it's happening very quickly. However, at the same time, we have an opportunity at the moment, because we're well placed, and somebody like you with your background is extremely well placed to be a futurist to some extent here. And God knows if anybody can kind of look ahead and say, well, where might this take us? Where do we want it to take us? Where do we not want it to take us? It's you, because you're passionate about this. You've been looking at media for a substantial amount of time. I'm sure your entire life, really. If you look ahead, and if you imagine you could teleport back to the beginning of film, really, as a medium, and kind of maybe you could give some advice then. But we have that opportunity now, I suppose. We have the benefit of certain media and art form behind us to give us some knowledge, but we also then can kind of look ahead and say, where might this go? What are some of the lessons we might want to learn? What do we want, and what do we not want, do you think, from some of these technologies? What advice do we want to give the future? It's
silly. I have all sorts of ideas about how I agree we should shape this. At this time now, we have an opportunity to make sure that this is done in a way that is human-centered. I also have this objectivity about it through my training, where I don't necessarily want to hold on to things for the sake of, or stopping progress for the sake of it. So I'm stuck between these different ideas. And then, so for a friend of mine, we were talking about this idea of the ancestor simulation idea, where we're all actually, it makes more statistical or kind of statistical sense for us to be part of a simulation as a society or as a humans than it does not to be, right? That given that the amount of aliens that are out there or races, and that it might make more sense that we're part of the simulation.
This is Nick Ballstrom's.
Right.
Right.
And so we're discussing this, and I think I felt myself a little bit kind of saying, well, that simulation would have to be so elaborate and so rich and so realistic to account for all the experiences that we have, that I'm not sure it affects me in any way differently, right? And that someone might say, what if it was the Truman Show type thing, right? And you found out that no one you've ever met was really real at all. And part of me is saying, well, given my interest in this idea of realism and how we're all just simulations in my head anyway, that I'm not sure. I feel like it makes too much of a difference.
Yes.
Of course it would if I found out. But taking that argument, my friend replied and said, I used to think that about the Matrix. Like, why does everyone want to leave the Matrix? Why don't they just stay in those vats hooked up to the wire and just live their life out? And I was like, yeah, I think that's kind of the idea. I say all this kind of implying that's possibly direction this is all going, and I wish I could say it wasn't, but like, yeah, I just I hope the transition to that period is just an easy one.
Isn't it weird though how much intention matters in this?
Yeah.
Because I don't mean to speak for everyone here, but I think what we all want is to take ourselves out of the Matrix and then put ourselves back in again, but on our own terms, isn't it?
Yes,
and we may choose
exactly.
exactly the same experience we were in before,
Yes.
but you want to know I loaded it. It's not the machine loaded me into it.
Now that you say that, they say that these oh God, when I don't even have the facts, so it could be an urban legend, but that these companies in the States that were making these powdered breads and cakes, they could have put powdered egg into it too, but they said no, we'll tell people they have to add an egg because that way they felt like they were actually cooking.
I heard that before.
Right.
Yeah, sense of participation. Yeah,
right. And I imagine the same thing being like, let's let people feel like they're controlling this virtual reality a little bit.
Well, in the Matrix, that's the description of why there's suffering in the Matrix. You know, apparently the original Matrix didn't have it, but actually people resisted it. It actually was necessary to make it stick to some degree so people could engage more.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
in that sense.
It seems like that's probably the way.
If we've looked forward there, if you look back at all your learning, you've obviously been on a very interesting journey. If you kind of aggregate it all together and kind of look for some key learning that stands out for you, maybe something that's just at the fore of your mind that stands out for you as being kind of important that you've taken from your work on a kind of a greater level, a meta level, what key learning do you think stands out for you?
The key thing that has worked for me is an interdisciplinary approach, which we've talked about, but the idea of calling on the knowledge and expertise of others and properly synthesizing it with our own expertise. The problem with that is that sort of work goes slower. We all have to learn each other's language. It doesn't often prove as fruitful as kind of working in your own little box. But related to that then is, as I've said already, is this focus on the tools we're using and what they mean, to try and have some complexity about the way in which we capture experience. If all of this is about me as a psychologist trying to figure out how emotions work, how attention works, then it's about saying, let's try and capture the richness of this in multiple measures, in multiple ways, without reducing it, but holding on to the learning that's traditionally come from the reductionist approach. Like the reductionist approach gives us answers. Now let's try and retain that, but let's make them more meaningful. So I think that's what has come from my work. It's this shift towards the measures we're using, this discussion around the way in which we conduct research.
It's a very nice point, that multidisciplinary point. What I'm imagining as you're describing it is a film set, because, you know, imagine saying, no, we're not going to do this in a multidisciplinary way. You know, it just ceases to become even thinkable. Not only not possible, but not even possible to think about. It just has to be at its very core. And it doesn't mean that, you know, the sound person won't have a particular emphasis that they'll reduce it down to, and you know, a lighting technician will have their particular priorities, and they will to some degree ignore the others because they need to focus on what they do. But still there's a gestalt, isn't it, when those people come together and you know, create something incredible which couldn't exist without the sum of those parts.
Exactly. And I think, like I said, it can be slower work, and it can mean that you're halfway through a project before you realize that the whole time you haven't been understanding each other. You could be finished a project and realize. And different people need different outputs. There's a pressure in academia to have publications and to bring in grant funding and to, you know, go to conferences. And people in industry are saying, I need an applied learning here for my work, and it's trying to capture what people's goals are, and that takes time.
Absolutely. It does, but it's great too, isn't it? Because there's so many problems you don't have to solve,
Yes.
and that you don't want to solve, but somebody else does.
Yeah,
I mean, at very least, I think about this on a technological level, that when I'm there creating experiences, looking at innovative, futuristic ways to do therapy, I often think, I'm so happy there's people in labs figuring out this technology. If I had to do that in order to do what I want to do with the technology, it'd be like filmmaker, great director walking into a room. Now, how do I invent a camera?
Yeah, and that's why it's really exciting
that.
to hear about I have a collaborator, Thomas Parsons, in the University of North Texas, and he says in his lab, half his PhD students are computer scientists and half of them are neuroscientists.
Yes.
In the one lab, and
brilliant.
so they're constantly working together. And that's what's good about the film set, is that that analogy that where the cameraman can immediately talk to the director and the lighting people can talk, they can try it
Nice
out.
feedback
And I think
loop,
that's what we need. We need resources, and we need places and approaches. We need an acknowledgement of a slower approach to this research, and we need facilities and a space to collaborate.
And that's why when you talk about IEDT and their psychology and technology approach, it is actually sometimes literally necessary to put those people in the same space.
Right.
UCD, we're not doing bad at that. There's some really good collaborations going on, but it is a weird thing existentially in terms of where you go, because I sort of just wander between buildings and psychology and philosophy and computer science. And
it's the physical space. And anytime I've reached out, there's people in the smart lab here, there's computer science, I've worked with you, there's the interdisciplinary guys downstairs in science, that like when we reach out, we can find these people, and then we have all our other stuff going on, that sometimes it's helpful just to pass them in a corridor rather than to have to set up this stuff. But we'll get there. We'll do it.
God knows what the buildings will look like in the future. These adaptive virtual spaces where we can keep change as the curriculum changes each year. The building will shift.
Right,
you know?
and I know there's work going on here about kind of use virtual reality technologies and computer science to use virtual reality technologies to bring people together in those spaces. That sounds exciting.
Well, we have no end of content to keep covering. That's for certain.
Sure.
Well, listen, Brendan, it's been fabulous having you on the podcast.
It's been really great.
People want to find out a bit more about what you do and keep in touch with your research and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
So, currently working on the lab website, which will be up soon, but I think Twitter is the best place. So my Twitter handle is @Bren Rooney. That's my personal one, and then we have one for the lab that we use together, and that's @ME_lab tweets.
I'll put a link anyway.
So ME lab tweets, and that's the easiest place to find us and keep in touch, and then through that we'll share the other links.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, look, fabulous having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I mean it when I say your work is extremely important. It really, really is, because it's facilitating, I think, so many other things that can come from it, whether it's the lab or whether it's SIGMAC, Media Art and Cyberpsychology and PSI. These are just really important things, because they aren't just important in of themselves, but more they create space and pave the way for other things that can happen. So keep up the great work, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, John.